Yeah, no. No, I think we just need one for a prop, in case we need to flip to something.
On such and such case.
Okay.
So we'll have multiple props. Beyond capitalism. Someone was asking what the event was, and
You had the first part?
what was the word?
We went back and forth. We went back and forth a long time with the press about the title, because they wanted something totally different, and they wanted something like, against capitalism or like undermining capitalism, and I was like, it's really not quite that. And the whole diverse economies research program of that I'll talk about, that's like a group of scholars all around the world that works on this, sort of says the goal is to move beyond capitalism, not to like pretend it doesn't exist or pretend that we can overthrow it with a violent revolution, necessarily. It's like
In a way relational. It's like a directionality.
it's a directional thing. It's a vector. Yeah, definitely. Moving beyond was the goal.
Well, I don't remember now what word I was subbing in there. It wasn't.
Oh, you had another word there? Maybe it was better.
When I was trying to describe the event, and I eventually said something that I won't say. I'll tell you.
Appropriate
What I
audience.
subbed in is another.
Not the right word. Well, there you go. Hello.
What do you think? Do you want to wait a few minutes? Or
Just a minute, because Noga's I see Noga's coming in, and then when she comes in, we can start.
Okay, perfect.
Hi, come on in. Grab a seat anywhere.
What's that? I think these are some kind of cord wrapper. So when we
It's been a long time since I talked to an 11-year-old.
How did it go?
That's great. Like 11-year-olds are pretty.
They're little people.
They're kind of they're a little grown.
Yeah, they're little people. They're not like babies.
Right.
Especially this one.
but you can see how we use
My other one is 8, almost 9, and she's very much 8, almost 9.
Yeah.
He's like 11 going on. Who knows what?
Yep. Carried that very well.
Hello. Yay.
You're getting into standing room only.
I know, right? Because nobody wants to sit right up front.
We try to keep it 6 feet, but they never want to sit in front.
No one wants in class. No one wants to sit in front. All right, I think whenever you're ready, we can start. Yeah. Oh, you're gonna introduce?
I said I would do this. Is this cordless mic working? Oh no. You can hear me. Oh, and now it's projecting a little bit. Okay, good. Hello everybody. Welcome to the Kelly Writers House. I'm really glad to be here tonight. I feel like it does feel important to be able to gather together in person, and yeah, thank you. It feels really important, and I know it's also hard. And so I'm grateful that you're all here. I'm grateful that you made it out. I'm also really happy to say we're broadcasting to YouTube, so there are people who are watching. Hello to the people on YouTube. We're thrilled you're here too. That's part of what it means today to gather, and I'm glad that's possible. But of course, we're all here to celebrate this fantastic book by Andrew Zitcer, Practicing Cooperation, Mutual Aid Beyond Capitalism. Yeah, this deserves a big round of applause. Jamila Medley will do the official introduction, I believe. But I have to say, I'm really excited for this particular pairing. I know we talked about a few ideas for how this event would go, and this felt really, really right. This is a conversation. There will be time for you to ask questions. There will be time for you to purchase this book. We have it for sale in the living room. If you feel at all uncomfortable in here and you need to get up, you need more space, there is sound in the living room. You can hear in there. We have restrooms in the back. We have restrooms upstairs. So that's also okay. So I think I've said the stuff. I'd just like to welcome Jamila Medley and Andrew Zitcer to the Kelly Writers House.
Wow, I have not had the pleasure to be in front of humans live, aside from my family and a few close friends in a long time, so I might have some nerves, but I'm very excited to see you all, and thanks for being here. My name is Jamila Medley. I use she, her pronouns. Why am I here interviewing Andrew Zitcer? So I guess just to say a little bit about myself. I came into doing work in the cooperative economy about a decade ago when I started working at Mariposa Food Co-op here in the neighborhood, so to speak, and went on to support the creation and development of the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance, which I was the executive director of for 4 years. And I left that position last year in May. And since have been doing some consulting work, continuing to support solidarity economy building, working with cooperatives, union co-op projects, nonprofits around town. And I seem to remember having a conversation with you at Mariposa Food Co-op on the second floor a decade ago, and now this book is here. Yeah. And so I'm pleased to have been invited to have this conversation with Andrew Zitcer, who is an associate professor of urban strategy at Drexel University. He studies cooperative social and economic practices, as well as the arts as a vehicle for community transformation. Andrew is also the co-founder of the Rotunda, a community arts venue in Kol Zedek Synagogue, a progressive Jewish congregation. Are you going to open us up and give us some initial thoughts?
I'll give some initial thoughts about this book and about this night. I want to start by thanking everybody who's here so much for coming out tonight. It really means so much to me to see all of you all in person, up close and personal. And it's especially meaningful to be doing it here at Kelly Writers House because this was the place that really incubated me and helped me grow as a writer, as a thinker, as a human being, as a citizen. And so from about 1997 till today, Writers House has been a beacon for me in my life, and I know it is for some of you in this room as well, who I've gotten to know through this place, which is really powerful to me. So to see my own name on the calendar for the Kelly Writers House and on the website for the Kelly Writers House really feels like coming full circle. So I'm glad I wrote the book, just even to be able to be here tonight. So I'll give a couple of words of introduction to this. Practicing Cooperation, Mutual Aid Beyond Capitalism. It came out in November from the University of Minnesota Press, and it's part of the Diverse Economies and Livable Worlds series, which is a series I'm very proud to be associated with because it's all kinds of thinkers who are thinking about the future of capitalism and the future of our political economy. It grew out of my dissertation that I did at Rutgers that was a comparative study of Mariposa Food Co-op and Weaver's Way Food Co-op, and that's how Jamila and I got to know each other. And when I finished that weighty tome of its own, I realized that I didn't want to stop thinking about cooperatives then, but I wanted to keep going and expand my inquiry beyond just food co-ops to other examples of cooperation. And when I was thinking about these examples of cooperation, I wanted to go beyond the sort of capital C co-op into projects that really were about social and economic transformation through cooperation. And we'll talk more about what that means later. So the book itself covers three main cases. The first case is a comparison between Weaver's Way and Mariposa, which we'll talk more about. The second is the community acupuncture movement, which I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes as well. But basically, the community acupuncture movement is a federation of over 200 clinics all over the country that offer low-cost group acupuncture treatments on a sliding scale and have a kind of anti-capitalist, anti-racist ethic that they stand behind in their work. And then the third case is, of course, how could I not do it? Headlong Dance Theater, one of the most amazing experimental dance theater companies in the country that for over 25 years and counting has sustained cooperation and collaboration. Although it's not a co-op, it's a sort of collectively, spiritually organized kind of constellation of very incredible people. And so over the course of 5 to 7 years, I did about 100 interviews with people in those various cases, and I engaged in what they call participant observation. I worked at the co-ops. I was on committees. I was a cashier. I stocked shelves at both Weaver's Way and Mariposa. At the acupuncture clinics, I actually went and got needles put in me in 14 different clinics in 3 different cities. And I went on, and I was part of the board of directors for Headlong Dance Theater for many years, which I did out of love and admiration, not out of trying to get a book out of it. But once I decided I wanted to write, I knew that that experience would provide a very valuable platform to do that work. So I came out, by the time it was done, with a 3-part argument, and I'll talk about that argument throughout the evening. But the first is that cooperation is a practice. It's something that can be refined, it's something that can be learned, it's something that can be, if not perfected, we can strive for the perfection of it as a practice, and it's something that's deeply social. And so I can talk more about practices and the foundation of that thinking in a little while. The second part of the argument is that cooperation occurs on multiple scales. And in the book, I talk about the scale of the body, that cooperation has to begin with the body, and that I learned from Headlong. It has to move to the scale of labor and organization, places like a writer's house, places like a Coltzetic synagogue, where cooperation is inherent in the labor relation. Then community economies as a scale of cooperation. So how are our economies and our main streets described and inscribed? And then finally, our hope is for a cooperative democracy, the largest scale of all. That we could take our bodies, organize them into labor, and move our community economies in a direction of a more just economic system. And then the third part of the argument is about exclusivity, and I know we want to talk about that. That co-ops really struggle with something that I call the paradox of exclusivity, which means that they need to be kind of exclusive so that people want to participate in them and they feel a membership, they feel a sense of connection. But if that exclusiveness or that exclusionary nature is drawn around pernicious boundaries like race, class, ableism, age, then they are very alienating. And a lot of co-ops fall into that trap without even realizing it. So the practices, the multiple scales, and the questions of exclusivity are sort of the journey that the book takes. And now I have finished introducing it, and I hand it over to you, Jamila.
Sure. So I thought we could just get started with establishing what I like to call some shared language. And you already kind of started to talk about co-ops, big C, which then implies co-op, little c, and cooperation. And so throughout the book, and assuming that not everyone here or on YouTube and who might watch this later has read the book yet, wanted us to just, if you could describe, what do you mean by co-ops and cooperation? They're clearly related and distinct.
Yeah.
Could you give us a rundown? What are you talking about here?
Yeah, sure. So co-ops, through their DNA, sort of do obviously cooperate, and they adhere to a set of international cooperative principles. A co-op, by definition, and this is the definition from the USDA, is a user-controlled, user-owned business that distributes its benefits on the basis of use, not on the basis of ownership, but on the basis of patronage or how much it's used. And these kinds of co-ops adhere to several cooperative principles, including democratic member control, one member, one vote, education and training, concern for the community, and cooperation among co-ops. So one of the things that we can really attach ourselves to in the cooperative tradition is this series of principles that helps us understand how to ethically operate and what to strive for. There are several different types of co-ops, which you know well, working at PACA. There are consumer-owned co-ops, like our Mariposas and our Weaver's Way. There are worker-owned cooperatives. There are cooperatives that are like producer-owned, which means that each co-op is owned by an individual, and then they federate up, like the way POCA is, the People's Organization of Community Acupuncture. Each clinic is separately owned as a small business, but they work together to share their services as a co-op. And then there's credit unions, and then there's housing co-ops, and there's lots of different types. To be a co-op is really just to have that legal classification and incorporation status, which doesn't even exist in every state in the United States, despite there being over 200 years of co-ops in existence. But when we talk about the little c co-op, the cooperation, that kind of cooperation has been happening since the beginning, right, in every society. The modern Western cooperative movement and those principles I mentioned go back to the mid-19th century in England, but obviously cooperation has been going on in indigenous communities, in communities of color, and throughout all expressions of social life. And so I was interested in looking beyond the capital C co-ops that have that incorporation status. I'm interested in looking at cooperation through a lens of principles and practices, narratives, and traditions of cooperation. And I think there's a lot of rich stories that we can tell about how co-ops help us prefigure a more hopeful future that doesn't depend on whether you're incorporated as a co-op or not.
Absolutely. Yeah, lots of formal co-ops never cooperate or incorporate as under those statutes, right? So there's a fluidity, of flexibility, I think, when we think about what a co-op is. So thanks for explaining that. Any other grounding terms to offer now? And I know we'll talk about some.
Yeah, just to go back to that idea of the paradox of exclusivity. I call it a paradox because, I do believe some level of exclusivity is desirable because I want people in cooperatives to feel like they belong and that they're not going to go shop at a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe's instead of shopping at their local food co-op because their local food co-op has a mushy identity or mushy boundaries. They should know what that cooperative advantage is. But where it becomes dangerous is, again, when those lines are drawn in ways that are discriminatory. And that discrimination is often not done intentionally, but that doesn't make it any less effective and pernicious in its character. So we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It is quite common for books to begin by naming a problem. As someone who works in the co-op sector, constantly defending co-ops and why, seeing that on the very first page of your book, you talk about co-ops being hard, and you even wrote, in the case of the local food cooperatives, I wondered why people did not just go to the new Whole Foods downtown if they wanted high quality, healthy food. Whole Foods did not ask for membership or monthly commitment of labor. So why are co-ops so hard? Why are you calling them out? What's the problem?
Yeah, right. Well, I think the reason why is that doing anything that goes against hierarchy, racialized capitalism, and rugged individualism is very hard to do in our system. I think the problem comes because of the way we've established the kind of baseline ground rules of our society. And when we try to think about doing things cooperatively, they require group agreement. They require, if not consensus, they require kind of conversation and deliberation. They require real authentic democracy in their operations and in their decision making, and hopefully engagement in a larger community. And all of these things are anathema to the sort of ethos of a Whole Foods, which is really corporate exploitation and just a purely transactional relationship. And so when we talk about co-ops as standing aside or against this prevailing political economic trend, they often talk about themselves as having a cooperative advantage or an ethical premium. And I call it also an ethical challenge of doing it this third way. There's a quote in my book. There's an early co-op organizer, Jacob Holyoake, who says, if there are to be moral sellers, there need to be moral buyers. And that creates a collective action problem. Like, how do we know that we're moral buyers? Like, what is that? How do we have that leg to stand on? And I think that this question of morality and ethics in our purchasing, in our living arrangements, in our economic relationship around labor is something that we need to constantly interrogate and perfect. And that's what makes cooperation so hard, because it's a lot easier. Do you remember when Amazon had those buttons where you could like order a button and just push it and it would send you a new thing of Tide once a month. I think they got rid of them for some more advanced like surveillance technology. But they used to sell you these little Tide buttons, and you could push a button and just have it delivered the next day or overnight. And that's just the anathema of what a cooperative is.
Yeah.
It's totally different. And I actually wanted to ask you, Jamila, what are some of the challenges that you've seen when you've been trying to live in that cooperative advantage? You know, have you seen some of this yourself?
I mean, certainly there's this degree of unlearning, I think, that many of us have to engage, particularly if we're in our adult forms and we haven't, you know, grown up with these principles and values and practices that you're alluding to that are in the formation of cooperation. There's a lot to learn, to unlearn. I can think of, you know, working on a project here that PACA worked on, the 20 book clubs, 20 cooperative businesses program. And I worked with one group that was led by a community organization. And the guy who was directing the project, he had like neighbors and volunteers involved in a study circle together. And there was such a challenge in getting him to allow the group to learn how to make decisions together, rather than him assuming the responsibility of having to make those decisions on behalf of the group. So we butted heads like the first 2 or 3 sessions, because I just couldn't figure out. I'm like, I keep coming back to the group, and he just keeps saying the things, and the group is quiet. They don't know how to stand up, you know, or assert themselves in their own power, because they don't assume they have any.
Yeah.
And so eventually I kind of like came around to understanding the dynamic that was happening. And he and I had a conversation about power and democracy and sharing. And these were just things that he hadn't really contemplated being possible in the context of the work that he was doing. And so that even became a part of our study, was like, what does it mean to have democratic practice?
Yeah.
What does it mean to have democratic participation, and for us to have equitable voice in a space together?
Yeah, that's not easy work.
Yeah. So yeah, cooperation, big C, little c, co-op is challenging for sure. But could you share, what are the benefits of doing this work anyway? And I think, you know, I tend to also think of a definition of cooperatives as being one that these formations are really useful at supporting people in meeting, and are most beneficial when they're supporting people in meeting basic needs, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so in the book, you focus on food, medical health care, and art, right? So why should people use co-ops as a way to meet these basic needs? And why is this personal for you?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, first of all, I think that at their best, co-ops offer what I would call an ontology of hope, a sort of whole system framework that's hopeful and bridges the divide between the sort of the persistently terrifying now and a future that we can imagine that's more liberatory and emancipatory, and an opportunity to embrace a solidarity economy or a community economy that is post-capitalist in its nature, meaning that like capitalism may not wither away and die, but we can kind of advance practices that are non-capitalist in its face and try to grow the proportion of non-capitalist and anti-capitalist activity that occurs under a nominally capitalist system. There are deep problems with the food system. There are deep and abiding problems with our healthcare system. And our art system is totally unequal and unfair and elitist and inaccessible. And so I wanted to think about how we could use deliberative, democratic, and accessible structures to make a lot of it more accessible and possible for more people. And that really is so true in the cases that are in this book. If you read the sort of affirming work that they do to try to challenge those conditions of oppression and those conditions of exploitation and alienation, I think you'll come away with a lot of respect and some critique for these cases, for the work that they do. But to me, the book feels very personal. This feels like a very personal manifestation of my own values of the work that I hope we can all be advancing collectively.
Thanks. I came into co-ops as through food co-ops, and most of the time when I'm talking with folks, and I'm like, "Do you know what a co-op is?" They say, "Oh, like a food co-op." Right, so people, it's kind of like the gateway to the co-op economy is often our food co-ops. It's a grocery store, and it, they've also earned. It can be up for debate whether or not this is true, but our food co-ops have a reputation of being a place where hippie, affluent white folks go to buy their crunchy granola food, and that's all good, and it's healthy, and it smells a certain way. But we know that communities across the world, as you've already shared, and for all time have practiced cooperative economic strategies for survival and to thrive in their communities. And I wonder if you could just talk about some of the cooperatives, and you gave some examples of these kind of non-traditional formations in communities of color in particular. What are some of the stories, narratives of those experiences?
Yeah, sure. And I'll sort of speak to some of them because I cover it in a certain extent in the book, and then I'll ask you to talk a little bit about some of the work that you're currently doing with some of these co-ops, especially in communities of color. So in chapter 2 of this book, I spend a fair bit of time talking about cooperatives around the world, including many that are led by communities of color. As marginal as some people believe co-ops to be, it's really important to note that 1 in 6 people on the planet hold a membership in a cooperative, and that there are 100 million cooperative memberships in the United States alone out of 320 million people, and that it's a $3 trillion industry in the United States. And this is only counting the formal C co-ops, not all of the cooperation that we're talking about tonight. So in the book, I spend a little bit of time writing about the worker recuperated factories in Argentina, which came about as the result of harsh structural adjustment and economic reform in the 1990s and led capital to flee manufacturing. And workers bravely stood up and took back their own factories and started to run them as cooperatives. And in 2015, there were nearly 300 of these factories employing over 16,000 people. So that's one example of cooperation that's not a grocery store, right? I also write about cooperatives in Japan. There's these seikatsu, or livelihood cooperatives, which have over 350,000 members, and it's a movement that's led by women. The Seikatsu Club operates stores, worker co-ops, milk factories, and elder and child care facilities, and they're involved in food safety and consumer activism, and even run their own political candidates. So they're part of that conversation as well. Finally, I talk about black cooperation in the United States, which has a tremendous legacy going back to before the Civil War, as chronicled by scholar Jessica Gordon-Nemhart in her book Collective Courage. And I'm very excited to be on a panel with her talking about this book in a few weeks and about her work as well. And this legacy involves mutual aid societies, community development credit unions coming out of the black church, revolving micro-lending circles called susus, and worker and consumer co-ops. And recently, the movement for Black Lives highlights cooperatives as an important plank in their community development vision. And yet, the co-ops in this book, the cooperative projects in this book, are not BIPOC-led organizations. And I think that's a limitation in my own research approach, in my sort of intrinsic snowball sampling of like what's right in front of me as a white, hippie, affluent, crunchy granola person who smells a certain way. I found myself kind of connecting with other co-ops, and I want to kind of wonder how these co-ops function in communities of color, right? So in the case of Weaver's Way, not so well. They struggled to open a store in Oak Lane in Philadelphia that they were only able to keep open for 3 or 4 years. And they were not able to gain traction in that community, in my opinion, because of a lack of reasonable outreach and ongoing member engagement that should have been part of that practice from the beginning. Similarly, acupuncture is such a white profession, but even though in the community clinics that happen all over the country, there's a great diversity among the patients, they have a very hard time recruiting acupuncturists of color because of the debt and because of the cultural stuff and the baggage. And so I think that it's an ongoing question of both in my work and in the world, how do we sort of raise up and support the work of BIPOC-led co-ops? And I know that's some of the work that you're beginning to journey on.
Yeah, I mean, it's some interesting paradoxes and opportunities, I think, amongst the sets of challenges. And I think we'll talk about some of this a little bit later, but, you know, I think, you know, there's the dynamic of our efforts at formations that are creating multiracial and multi-class cooperatives, right? And where our spaces for BIPOC folks to be in those, right? Yeah. And we usually experience those cooperatives as already have a formation of a culture that's usually like white dominant culture, right? And so there are these internal struggles and shifts and questionings that a lot of our cooperatives, particularly in the food co-op sector, are having around this question, as you referred to the cooperative development consulting firm and their effort to do this kind of question is like, is everyone welcome? Right? So that's one of the spaces in which I think, you know, folks of color are really trying to struggle alongside our white family members and our white community members and co-workers to really try to figure out how do we do this multiracial project together. And food co-ops are a site for that practice, for sure. And then I think there's other sectors, for example, like the worker co-op sector, right? So this sector is where people who are forming a business, they're gonna work at the business. It can be a pizza shop, it can be a consulting agency, and anything in between. They're gonna own that business together democratically and equally together as worker owners. And what we've been seeing over the last decade or so is increasingly, again, out of need, right? That communities that are most marginalized in our society, undocumented folks, women of color who are traditionally in low-wage labor jobs, folks in Black communities and poor folks are creating these formations of worker co-ops to respond to their basic needs and to find a strategy for empowerment and ownership and wealth creation for themselves and their communities, right? And so that is like a leaps and bounds different kind of paradigm in which we're talking about how our racialized selves are experiencing the power of the economic project of cooperation. I'll stop there because I could.
Well, we have other questions to get to, but I think we can keep that thread going because you have a question coming up about gentrification and.
That's right.
Yeah, so we'll come to that.
We'll get there. But this notion of the paradox of exclusivity, and you know, I think our food co-ops are the easy example to kind of think about how that shows up. But like all kinds of institutions and experiments for social justice and good in our society, co-ops and other sites that are practicing cooperation also struggle in their aims to address racial and economic justice. And I think it would be great for us to talk about what is the paradox of exclusivity and the challenge of unintended bias many co-ops struggle with. How do our histories, the co-op histories, connect the dots to having arrived to this kind of a challenge? And I mean, this is up for argument, and I don't know if we'll get to it tonight, but I seriously do have this question: is everybody really welcome? Is that the actual goal?
Yeah. Is that the goal? Well, the first story in the book is a story about Weaver's Way from the 1990s. So it didn't happen just yesterday. But the story goes something like, the co-op is the anchor of the Green and Carpenter retail corridor in Westmount Airy. And people buzz and shop, and it's just like incredible vibrancy around that corner. And what they were experiencing in the 1990s was that after the school next door let out, there'd be an influx of kids coming in to try to shop at the store. And it was a nuisance to the staff because they would come in with, they didn't have the right change, they didn't know what they wanted. When they got to the cash register, they were throwing food around the aisles. Maybe there was a little bit of shoplifting, and it was just like the kind of behavior you might expect from middle schoolers coming in to shop after school. At the time, the co-op was only open to members, and you had to pay a fee in order to become a member, and in order to have a membership in good standing, you had to work a few hours a month at the co-op, which a lot of co-ops used to have. And Weaver's Way transitioned away from that, and Mariposa transitioned away from that. But at the time, that was in force. And so what they said to the kids that were coming over to shop is, you can only shop in the co-op after school if your parent is a member. So they checked the door, and they would say to the kid, is your parent a member? Is your parent a member? And the ones whose parents were members, they would let in to shop, because that lowered the overall number of students coming in at once. And the kids whose parents weren't a member, they would say, sorry, you got to go to the corner store, a different corner store. Well, it happened that the majority of the member owner children were white, and the majority of the non-member children were black. And so what you had is a white manager standing at the door, turning away black kids and welcoming in white kids. And the board member who I spoke to about this was like, if you don't think people still remember that story 20, 25 years later, forget about it. That influences the whole Weaver's Way project from top to bottom. Was that a deliberate racial exclusion strategy that they sat in a board meeting and decided they were going to do? Absolutely not. But they messed up, and they tried to fix that problem by creating school-based co-ops and a marketplace program where they would go into the schools and teach the kids about healthy snacks and cooperative economics. And so they moved the locus of the problem out of the co-op aisle and figured out how to solve it in the schools. But these kinds of things are inherent in what I would call a white spatial imaginary, where there's this essence of like wanting to define things according to the interests of whiteness, as if whiteness is normal and whiteness is ubiquitous, and the values that inhere in that. And so when they went and opened a store, 15 years later at the behest of a community organization in West Oak Lane, and it wasn't surviving, there were several people in my interviews who said, maybe if we sold cigarettes and lotto tickets, people would have stayed. And I was so surprised that they were willing to go on the record with me and make those claims, instead of saying we didn't do the work of building bridges between communities, between races and classes, between life experiences, to really do the cooperative project right. So that's the paradox of exclusivity. And it doesn't just occur in the food co-op space, it occurs in a lot of cooperative spaces, because white supremacy and the white spatial imaginary is so deeply embedded in the way we organize, that doing things in a multiracial or multi-ethnic coalition is always leaving people sort of on the back foot, I think. And there's a lot of struggle with that. And even at Mariposa, I was told at one point, when Mariposa was members only, they used to have a sign that said, don't let strangers into the co-op. Don't leave, close the door behind you in the old co-op, right? So who's a stranger, who's welcome, who's a member, who's not? These are the essential kinds of questions.
Yeah. I mean, in thinking about the urban co-op space, gentrification really complicates what some of the co-ops are trying to do. And it's interesting because I also do work over the last 5 to 7 years. There's been this huge growth of food co-op development actually in Black neighborhoods all across the country. And so some of the narrative in those communities is that, they're using the food co-op business model, this enterprise, as a tool of liberation, right? As a liberatory practice for their community. And they are challenged to maintain or sustain leadership that is Black, right? Because of the challenge, the challenge and opportunities that gentrification brings in. So they're kind of at this crossroads of having these conversations of yes, everyone is welcome, but what is the sense of belonging? Who is this actually really for? And so, but on the other hand, in some cities, co-ops led by more recently arrived white folks. I think this has happened in Kensington and has happened in South Philly here. In gentrifying neighborhoods, they present this challenge. What's going on? How are our co-ops, whether they're food co-ops or other kinds of cooperatives, complicit and implicated in harmful kind of ways when it comes to gentrification?
Well, I think it's a recapitulation of all of the social, economic, political, and cultural problems that already exist in our society. It's not that they're co-op problems; it's that they're societal problems that are infecting co-ops. And so I think of a city like Philadelphia as such a segregated place, and I think that integrated places are really hard to find, and they're really hard to build, and they're really hard to sustain. In places like Philadelphia with such extreme income inequality, it's hard to imagine how you can build shared sovereignty and shared community. And I fear that there's this like mini co-op industrial complex of consultants and supporters who mostly support the white-led co-ops in doing these plans where they have to raise like $3 million or $5 million before they can open their doors. And as we saw with Kensington and South Philly, that can take 10 years or more. But these are people who are really patient, and they have the financial wherewithal to make a $400 investment up front and not see anything back from that for a decade. And I don't think they're necessarily, not to call out those specific co-ops because I'm not involved in their organizing, but just I don't think that the white-led co-ops are always thinking about concern for the community in the broadest way. And that doesn't mean like just being benevolent to communities of color. It means really being led by and supporting communities of color in ways that are deep and abiding.
Yeah, it is it's a minefield out there, and I think because of the activity that's actually happening in the Black-led food co-op movement, it's really changing the dynamics of what it means to form a food co-op and how what variables count towards the success of those cooperatives, as well as what funding instruments become available. So there's an entire shift happening in that way.
Yeah.
But moving into thinking beyond food co-ops, as you described the People's Organization of Community Acupuncture, or POCA, I understood you to say that their organization wasn't only striving to be welcoming, but rather that they wanted to foster a place where everyone does belong.
Yeah.
Regardless of race, body, whoever you are, we really want you here. Why is that important?
So a cooperative democracy, as I talk about in the last chapter of the book, depends on every body being included. And I mean every body. If the work we do is exclusive, even unintentionally so, then what we're doing is reproducing white supremacy and racialized capitalism. And what they're trying to do in POCA, the People's Organization of Community Acupuncture, is anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and sort of anti-mainstream healthcare, or anti the hoarding of healthcare. And that's a lot of antis. But they are for a lot of things too. They are for trauma-informed care, they're for affordable treatments, they're for group healing, and for democratizing the provision of acupuncture. And one acupuncturist told me that when she was in acupuncture school, she was told that she would only be able to attract patients that looked like her. That she said, well, I'm white, I'm fit, I'm Jewish, I have straight hair, and that's who's going to come to my practice, so that's who I should cultivate as my clients. And the whole notion of POCA is to reject that premise and to say that, like, we're going to strive to treat the whole community. How do they do that? They do it through three ways. They do it through the sliding scale of $20 to $45 as opposed to $80 to $100 that you can easily pay at a private acupuncture clinic. They do it through being trauma-informed, and specifically I learned that one of the reasons why they treat in groups and don't ask people to disrobe is because the notion of putting people in private rooms and asking them to take off their clothes with a practitioner present can be very triggering for a lot of people. I thought it was an efficiency thing, like they just needed to treat a lot of people quickly, so they just roll up your sleeves and get your acupuncture. But they've come to understand that it actually is much more comfortable for people as well. And then the third thing that they do is they resolutely refuse to give lifestyle advice. They don't tell you how to diet. They don't tell you to stop smoking. They don't tell you what to eat. They just say, we're here to give you acupuncture and a place to nap, and that's it. And I think by being radically open in those three ways, they're trying to be much more accessible. But there's low wages in that work. The pandemic was incredibly threatening and disruptive to that work. There's burnout of volunteers in that co-op, like in all co-ops. And so these practices of these communities are always under threat, and they're always marginal. So we have to be thinking of ways we can constantly bolster and support them.
Yeah. I think we're going to do maybe a couple more questions, and then we want to have some time for y'all to get some questions in. You write that the cooperative impulse needs to be fostered through repetition over time, like a muscle that gets strengthened by exercise. And that for cooperation to reproduce itself throughout society, it is vital to start at the most intimate scale. This is supposed to create an opening to undertake a fundamental reorientation of practice at all scales, putting bodies in service of a more cooperative workplace, economy, and democracy. Mm-hmm. And so we've talked about how our racialized bodies intersect with the co-op practice, and too often it's in a way that produces unintended harm. Yet in this, you're offering up something quite essential when connecting cooperative practice and bodies. Mm-hmm. I think of the intimacy involved in cooperation, that over and over again we recommit our bodies to the work, building trust with others, deepening our relationships through this enterprise that we believe is really a formation and a path towards justice, and it depends on this intimacy. It requires a lot of trust. Yeah. What can you share with us about this intersection between cooperative practices and bodies? How do you understand that?
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I mean, bodies are a paradox in and of themselves, because on one sense they bound us and delimit us from others. We've only got the one body, and we're separated by the boundaries of the body from the other people around us. But that's a misnomer in so many ways, because we're united through care. We're united through vulnerability, and we're united through a vision of a social self, which is a self that is formed only through its relationships with others. And this is a deeply Buddhist concept, but also has been articulated in Western philosophy by George Herbert Mead and others, feminists, care ethics theorists. And the pandemic has taught us so much about intimacy and bodily contact. In order to kind of sustain the care that we need to show for bodies, we have to move at the speed of trust, mm-hmm. as Adrienne Marie Brown teaches us. And that trust needs to be earned. And so I was really inspired by Headlong when it came to talk about the awareness of bodies. And when you have a chance to read the book, you'll see that I brought these diagrams when I interviewed Headlong dancers, and they actually drew on these figures, these non-gendered human bodies, what it felt like to bodily be in community in Headlong. And then they narrated and told stories that are in the book about the beautiful intimacy and the challenging and terrible intimacy of what it meant to be in community in Headlong with the body. And so it's just my belief that if we don't get our bodies right, then we won't get our cooperation right. And that has everything to do with racial questions and ability questions and gender questions and age questions. And I really encourage everybody to take a chance to look through those diagrams and the stories those dancers told about what it meant to be at the moment of the body, at the body on the line, and that will begin to teach us what we need to know.
Yeah, and I think we're getting to the arc of this narrative, as you stated also at the beginning, of like where these practices and where this escalation of co-ops and cooperation gets us to this idea of democracy, mm-hmm. right? So. And that. I think for those of us that do practice cooperation, we understand that democracy is beyond the ballot box, right? It's not just about representative democracy. So why are co-ops potential sites, not just for expressing and accumulating economic power, but how are they, or could they be used as sites for fostering political power in our communities? What are the things that co-ops have to offer us that build our muscles for civic engagement in other spheres of life?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you so much that democracy is something that has to be done in our families. It has to be done in our workplaces. It has to be done in our co-ops. It has to be done in our communities. That democracy isn't just a sometimes thing. It's an all-the-time thing. And the way that works in the world of cooperation is collaboration and connection among co-ops. That the federation of initiatives is so important, whether that's through PACA, the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance, through the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, or regional gatherings of cooperatives that work to support each other and build power that way. The importance is of collaboration and working at multiple scales, and then we can learn democracy by doing it. That's just the only way.
And it's messy.
Yeah, and it's messy.
And I think just to close us on our conversation and leave some time to have others join in, you are an academic, and you wrote about cooperation and cooperatives. You're not an objective viewer of these things. As you mentioned, you've been a participant. They're essential and important in your life. So I didn't see or interpret or take in your book as a purely academic pursuit. You're telling of a story that says the way to a more just and equitable society lies in the widespread adoption of cooperative practices, which you wrote. So just before we end, please tell us about the importance of narrative in our ability to understand, promote, and actualize cooperation. What's the beginning, middle, and end of the story?
Well, there's no more appropriate place to have that question than here at the Kelly Writer's House. That's an amazing segue to our last question about narrative. I believe that this book was written as a very affirming but critical take on cooperation that asks really difficult questions about how these particular cases and then the things we can learn from these particular cases are made manifest. And in asking those questions, I'm guided entirely by narrative. And in being guided by narrative, I'm guided by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who I spend a lot of time writing about in the book. And he has a quote that says, "I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part." And the importance for us of narrative is to reclaim the narrative of the cooperative tradition, to not allow it to be stolen by white supremacy, to not allow it to be stolen by only able-bodied, cisgendered people, and to reclaim cooperation to transcend its traditions while still being informed by its traditions, and write exciting and important and urgent shared new narratives.
I feel like you just gave a sermon.
Thank you.
Preach. Well, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Jamila.
We're happy to have some conversation with you all here in the room with us. For those who are on YouTube, we're going to be passing around a microphone. So if you have a question, comment, I'm going to